Hi, my name's Phil Craig. I'm a writer, a TV producer, a lover of stories, and a connoisseur of scandal. And I'm on a mission to bring you the most scandalous tales ever told. So thanks for joining me here at the Scandal Mongers podcast. I am back. I am back home, back to my beloved bar. You see the duty-free, the little white packagey things they put around the gin. Yeah, back from the Dolomites with my booty. And a wonderful holiday. Oh my goodness, any of you stayed till the end of the last episode? You saw me on my hotel balcony looking out at the mountains while we walked, we skied, we ate huge lunches. It's such a lovely place. A kind of mixture of German and Italian, and it's right on the border, Austria and Italy. Beautiful. And thank you for watching the last episode. I got clickbait alerted, though. Is that a word? Clickbait alerted. The producer, Theo, said that YouTube had temporarily lowered the exposure or limited the viewability because I think it was because I mentioned Meghan in the title. But I mentioned Meghan and Harry in lots of titles. But the show wasn't really about her. I talk a little bit at the beginning with Mock about Meghan in last week's show, but it's mostly about Peter Parker's amazing book about gay rights and gay lives. And I recommend it to you. But anyway, yeah, so I think if you mention something and the show isn't really about it, there's an algorithm. Goodness knows how they know. There's not a human being watching every single thing uploaded. But anyway, they thought it was clickbait. So they, well, I feel ashamed. I hope I have not misled or baited anybody into clicking and then being disappointed with what they clicked on. Although I probably have done that for different reasons many times before. But yeah, so from now on, I'm going to have very simple and very clear titles. I don't want to go into YouTube jail again. But lots of you did watch and some lovely comments. And thank you very much, Welly Girl 8736. Brilliant podcast this week. Thank you so much for educating us more about the lives of men like this who fought a valiant fight for gay rights. Anne Campbell 9621. I think you've been mentioned not here before, Anne. Your name seems familiar. Thank you for staying with me and not being put off by the clickbait. Another cracking good show, Phil. I was born in the mid-60s and I'd never heard before of that How to Spot a Homo article. What shocking, horrific treatment we made people suffer. And this is what some evangelical Americans want to bring back. Do they? Goodness. Well, maybe some do. I'm sure that most don't, but maybe some do. But yeah, it was a very thought-provoking show. And actually, even though a lot of it was sad about people who had to live on the margins of society, really, or on the margins of the law, there was also a lot of colour, a lot of humour, a lot of affection in the way Peter tells their stories. Final comment, Sweep 658. I don't think I've heard of you before, Sweep. Thank you for listening or watching. Interesting and absorbing podcast, you say. Well, I quite agree. Thank you. You are all excellent speakers, and the rapport between you was great to watch and hear. And thanks especially to wonderful Mock for showing us such compassion. Yeah, it was great being with Mock. We are going to do maybe a monthly thing or every 6 weeks. It is quite nice having a co-host, although I don't mind rambling on by myself, as you may have noticed. It is nice having a co-host. And Mock will be back with his compassion and his great new hair. Yeah, if you're interested in the hair, it's at the beginning of the last episode. That's not clickbait. We do genuinely talk about Mock's hair. Anyway, now, special exclusive. This week's show is very much about empire. But I'm also taking the opportunity. It is now exactly 1 month and 2 days before the publication of my book. I will be talking about my book a lot. Be warned. 1945, The Reckoning, which is the final volume in a trilogy I've written about Britain, the war, the empire. It took me 20 years because I had a TV career as well. But this last volume, I'm very proud of it. And it really does steam into some very hot contentious modern debates about empire, about race, about colonialism, and about how we should remember history, especially the history of Britain and some of Britain's allies and dominions, Australia. These are debates that rage today. Very hot. Some people rush to defend the imperial history and point to all the great things that Britain achieved. Others point to the history of slavery, economic expropriation, oppression, colonial wars. All of this is valid and interesting. But one of the things in the book that I really excited me was realizing that these debates, they didn't start in the age of the internet. I mean, they were going on when I was at university, but they were going on many decades before, during the Second World War, even earlier. There's always been a very, very um, powerful and high-profile argument about the pros and cons of empire, which is why I'm so pleased to get as my guest this week, Sathnam, who has written several brilliant books. And I think he's quite hard to get. He's in a lot of demand. So I'm really pleased that he's joining me later in the show. But before I reach him, I thought I might do a world exclusive and for the very first time, read out some extracts from my book. Yep, it isn't even in print yet, but I've got the final proofs in front of me. And I think as I sit here on Friday, 21st March, the presses are rolling. And I think somebody's also doing an audio record. In fact, I know they are for Audible and other audio apps. And I'm quite excited because one of the figures in the book is Clement Attlee, the British Labour Prime Minister who comes to power after Churchill in 1945. Well, his grandson is an actor called Richard Attlee, and he is narrating my book, which I'm thrilled about. There are a couple of other acts too, because there are other voices, Indian voices, female voices. So it'll be like a sort of intercut. He's the main one. Anyway, 1945, The Reckoning. If any of you have read any of my earlier World War II books, you see my style is to weave the story through real people, hopefully people that will be interesting and new to the readers. So there are big themes, there are big issues of military history, economic history, the alliances, and of course empire and colonialism, and how, especially in terms of India, because this book is very much set in the Far East and India, the movement towards independence. But instead of just writing theoretical or analytical material, I try to weave in and lead really with the stories of actual people and who are in the middle of all this. Some of them are genuine history makers. Some of them, I suppose you could say, just ordinary people to whom history is happening. And perhaps now and again they can give it a little shove. But that's my style. And I've got some great characters in this book. Some of them you may have heard of. Subhas Chandra Bose, the big Indian radical who throws in his lot with the Japanese. General Thimaia, who is his almost like polar opposite, an Indian officer in the Indian army, who is no fan of the empire, but he doesn't want to trust the Japanese. So he stays loyal to the British. And their intercut is a really important part of the book. But there are soldiers, there are prisoners of war, there are lots of people, about 8 or 9 main characters. And I thought I'd just start by reading a little bit about one of them, perhaps my favorite. I don't know whether you can fall in love with somebody you've never met. But I got my hands on the diary of a nurse, Angela Noblet. Later in her life, she was called Angela Bolton. She's been dead many years, but she was in her early 20s when she wrote this remarkable diary. And I think it also illustrates my point about how so many of these debates that we think are so fresh to us were going on in the minds of people then as well. Debates about empire, the rights and wrongs of British rule, and what the war was really for, and what the war end should be, and what the future should be like. She's also funny and smart and very brave. So I'm going to leap in with a little passage here I'm going to read. This is set in 1943. So yeah, the book is really about the end of the war, but I do little preambles with some of my characters to follow their journeys. So here goes. And this is an example, I think, of how I try to weave an individual story in with a bigger story, which you'll realize in a minute what that bigger story is. Bengal, 1943. Angela Noblet was in love. A love which, just as matron had commanded, she kept carefully separate from her hospital duties, where she remained under the command of her amour, the newly promoted Lieutenant Colonel Edward Lossing. She and Teddy walked and picnicked, dined and danced. At the local concert hall, they watched the latest American films together. Blood and Sand with Tyrone Power was a favourite, their feet crunching on half-chewed betel nuts as they stood to sing God Save the King. Then they'd stroll back to the hospital arm in arm, alert for snakes and jackals, passing by the naked, grey-bearded sadhu, holy man, as he recited his hypnotic evening prayers. And soon the lovers even had a song. It's a quote. We took a truck to the River Damabah, a mile or so away from Asansol, taking along a wind-up gramophone with us, some records and a rug to lounge upon. And there, for the first time, I heard a recording of the great cellist Pablo Casals playing Après un rêve by Fauvre, an experience that made such an impression on me that when I hear that plaintive melody so many years afterwards, I am wafted straight back to a moonlit river walk with a vista of distant mountains and romantic memories of my first real love affair. But in India, one always swings between the earth and the stars. I remember as I closed the lid of the gramophone, I saw the busy scarab beetle rolling its ball of dung along the ground. Angela shared nothing of the physical side of this relationship with her diary, but the couple were close enough to travel and leave together, although she did carefully note that separate bedrooms were in use at all times. One day, after leaving Asansol on a slow train journey towards a lake resort called Bimtal, they suddenly ground to a halt alongside a goods train. "What's that noise, darling? That tapping?" "I can see some people under the other train. Look, I think, yes, hundreds of them." "What are they doing?" "It's sticks. They have sticks and little bowls." Good God, the poor wretches must be desperate. Angela had never shied away from the harsher side of life in British India, but now, peering through the grimy window of the carriage, her eyes slowly adjusting to the dark, she was suddenly face to face with something horrific, something that today many people consider a war crime, even a genocide. Creeping along the tracks underneath the goods train were dozens of men and women pushing bamboo spikes up into the slatted floor of the wagons in the hope they might puncture a sack of grain. A thin trickle of wheat was their reward, which they caught in their small bowls. The driver knew they were there and did nothing to stop them. When the time came to move on, he let off a loud whistle to give them a moment to escape from under his wheels. Angela wondered aloud about people like this being not so sympathetically treated elsewhere, parents maimed or killed in their desperation to find food for their families. A sergeant who had joined her at the window said half the grain in that train would be gone by the time it reached Calcutta. After an uncomfortable night, made more so by what she had witnessed and by the hard beds of the ladies' restroom at Bareilly station, they took another train up into the mountains. And once again, the troubles of wartime India interrupted the journey. An elderly Indian man started up a political conversation with them, asking what they thought of Gandhi and his iniquitous imprisonment as a result of the Quit India campaign, and the fact that Indians under British rule were starving to death in Bengal. Quote, "I told him about the plundering of the goods train. He looked at me and remarked severely that because of the Japanese invasion there was no rice coming in from Burma, and he asked me, when are we going to drive those fellows out? We were suitably apologetic, but explained that we could not manage without Gandhi's cooperation. He demanded to know how Mahatma Gandhi could help us when we just thrown him in prison. This seemed like rather a circular argument, so he sat and smiled at him. He beamed back expansively through his large spectacles, salaaming affectionately when we left the train." This polite but firm disagreement on a train to a beautiful village where food was plentiful, tourists lounged on the verandas of splendid hotels, and spent lazy days fishing by the lake captures perfectly a sense present in many sources from this time, both Indian and British. Anger mixed with fatalism. An understanding that, yes, of course, war had made famine relief more difficult than ever before, but alongside that, a bubbling fury that Indians themselves, while risking their lives in huge numbers all around the world, were not in a position yet to help their starving compatriots. And always close to the surface, another feeling, no less powerful for never being tested in the real world, a feeling that however hard the authorities tried, and many of them did, they would surely, inevitably have done more had the food run dry in Surrey, the Western Cape, Manitoba, New South Wales, or North Island. And then I go into a longer passage all about the famine and the Bengal famine, which is a big, huge part of the story of British India. And I hope I give a very fair account of it. But anyway, that's an example of the start of the book. That's Angela. And I think, an example of how people at that time, nothing was simple. There was lots and lots of shades of grey. And Angela's story, if you like this, I'll read more of her, perhaps next week. Her journey, her adventure in politics, in love, in her experiences with soldiers, and indeed with Japanese soldiers as well. It's completely fascinating and very fresh. And I'm really excited to bring that and so many more stories out into the world soon in my book. So thank you for indulging me. You may have skipped ahead, but I think this is quite a good introduction to Sathnam, because Sathnam has written, I think, some very open-minded accounts of colonial history, but he's also very interested in the effect of the Burm, of that amazingly, occasionally energetic, often very innovative, sometimes very cruel and callous era of British history, and how it affected the world and continues to affect the world. Anyway, that's quite enough from me. I hope you enjoyed that little sneak peek of my book. I'll be back at the end to catch up with you all, and thank you for listening and watching. And here's Sathnam and more on Empire. Bye. Sathnam, thank you so much for joining me. You're the first person in my 2-year career as a podcaster. You're the first person I've met through TikTok.
Oh my gosh, which is amazing to me because I'm barely on TikTok.
Well, I was just
How do you
scrolling.
find me?
Well, I was scrolling through my normal diet of, I don't know, skiing videos probably, and you popped up talking about gin and tonic.
Oh, right. Yeah, well, that is very much in character for me, I guess. Yeah.
And, I think I sent you a little message, and now here we are.
Yeah, here we are. Yes.
And thank
Thank you
you.
for having me on your podcast.
Well, no, it's my pleasure indeed. In Empire World, you tell this story about rubber, and you talk
Yeah.
about, I think it was thinking of ways to entertain your mum, took you to Kew Gardens, and then you learnt an amazing story.
Yeah, I mean, Kew Gardens, you don't really associate with colonialism, do you, really? I mean, it's somewhere nice to literally take your mother or, have some scones. But actually, the botanic gardens, a network of botanic gardens around Empire, hundreds of them, were involved in the mission of Empire. And we've lost the idea of plants as technology. They very much were. So, I mean, one example would be cinchona, which is going back to my specialist subject, gin and tonic. Now, cinchona is the bark or the plant from which quinine is extracted. Quinine is the chemical that went into tonic, but also enabled European imperialists, crucially, to survive malaria, in Africa. And before quinine, West Africa was barely colonized. And if it was very much so afterwards, it was because of this one chemical. And it was enabled, in Britain, in the British Empire, by Kew Gardens, who helped the planting of cinchona plantations around the world. And therefore, we finally had this crop to help us, colonize these places.
Yeah, I didn't know actually at all much about the rubber story of rubber, and I think you explained that other empires in South America first start to really exploit it in the 19th century and create quite a lot of carnage in the process. And then somebody thinks, oh, some British person thinks we should grab these seeds. And that kind of triggers one of the world's biggest ever industries.
Yeah, actually, you could say that the way the British stole the rubber industry, well, the British and the Dutch, from the Brazilians, the South Americans, was the first example of kind of greenwashing, because the British were aware of how badly the Brazilians were treating, the people producing the rubber. I mean, it was the indigenous people there were driven out of their homelands, and even today, a lot of the indigenous people in Brazil who live now are descendants of the people who escaped this nightmarish industry which exploited people. Something like 30,000 indigenous South Americans were murdered or enslaved or tortured. And in some places, 90% of the Indian population was eliminated by atrocities and disease linked to the rubber industry. So the British.
This is by Spanish colonizers, effectively.
Yeah. And the people who were there in South America at the time. And the British wanted the rubber industry because obviously the rise of industrialization and so on. And this is one way to excuse it. So what began was basically a very complicated process of industrial espionage. It now seems easy, isn't it? You take some plants from one place, you plant them somewhere else. But there were all sorts of really quite profound challenges. First of all, we didn't really understand the rubber industry. Secondly, rubber plants, rubber seeds are recalcitrant, which means they die if they dry out. So if you transport them over long distances, they would often die. And also, it takes a very long time for a rubber tree to grow. So there was a very long process of experimentation. There were a bunch of kind of plant spies, people like Henry Alexander Wickham and Robert Cross, and over many, many decades, sometimes working with the Dutch, who were our competitors. The rubber industry was basically stolen from the South Americans and started in all around the world, in places like India and Sri Lanka, and of course, crucially, British Malaya.
So these seeds, I mean, is
Singapore.
anybody kind of controlling this, or it just sort of happens haphazardly? These seeds, they get them, they cultivate them, they whatever they do with them, they then ship them all the way to the other side of the world, to, I guess, to Singapore and into the Malayan Peninsula, and suddenly they create the world's biggest rubber industry. I mean, not suddenly, 'cause it takes 20
Very, very
years for it to,
slowly.
very slowly they create this. And of course, the car industry is taking off, so the demand for rubber is going crazy at this time.
Yeah, totally. And it was so successful that, when Ceylon or Sri Lanka's rubber industry finally got going properly, the plantations there began supplying rubber back to Brazil, where the rubber crop had been blighted by disease. And the industry was really struggling. But the place it really took off was Singapore. And when the price of coffee fell in that part of the world, which is what they were growing in huge quantities, the plantations on the Malay Peninsula switched to rubber, planting like 12,000 trees, I think, 12,000 acres of trees in 5 years. And around that time, the early 20th century, obviously we'd had the emergence of the auto car, the automobile, and also the World War, but it became such an important industry for the British that by 1913, Britain was supplying all its own rubber needs, but also it had become Britain's top re-export. The rubber eventually became this billion-dollar industry, and this is something that came with the help of Kew Gardens. So think about that the next
Yeah.
time you're admiring a particularly pretty rose.
Well, no, it's only about 2 miles away. We go there often. I shall certainly do that. So who's making all this money from this
Um,
billion-dollar industry?
well, some of the companies that exist today, like Dunlop, had plantations in that part of the world. Even today, I mean, rubber, I didn't realize, I actually didn't know rubber came from a plant, did you?
I think I might have done, yeah, but
But nowadays, the rubber comes from a combination of natural resources from plants, but also there's synthetic rubber. But that part of the world is still massively into rubber. So it's a real legacy of the British Empire. And it turned Malaya into the single most profitable colony for the British. And we don't talk about it. We talk endlessly about British India. We talk about America. We talk about the Caribbean. I don't think there's any real sense of Britain ever really being involved in Malaysia. This really annoys British Malaysians. If you know the comedian Phil Wang, it really annoys him because he's like, British people don't even know they were there. But the Malayans very much do remember the British being there.
well, the Malayan people at the time, what did they get out of this, if anything?
Well, I guess work and yeah, I mean, ultimately they had enough, and they didn't want to be part of this. And when there was a kind of during World War II, obviously, when Japan took over Singapore, afterwards, the Malayans, especially the communists there, very much did not want the British around anymore. And they could see how much money was being made, and they wanted to take control of their colony, like many decolonization movements. And so in 1948, we had the famous start of the Malayan emergency, something that is barely known about. But you've got a family connection to it, haven't you?
No, well, my dad was a national serviceman in the 50s, and apparently he was very close to being sent there. And yeah, it was a. We'll get to that. We'll certainly get to that. I want to talk about that a lot because it's in a way it's like Britain's mini Vietnam, isn't it? But
Yeah. But my
before we
favorite
get
is
to
one
it,
of
I just wanted to say
okay.
something, I guess, about my own work. I've been looking into the story of the Second World War in the Far East, and I think one of the things it's quite hard for British people to understand now is that when the Japanese swept through that area in the early year of the first couple of years of the war, we know now that the Japanese behaved stupidly and cruelly to many of the people that they had kind of colonized themselves or liberated, whatever word you want to use. But at the time, there was joy. There was mass joy. And we find it hard to say that now, I think, a lot of us. But there was huge pleasure. It was seen as, isn't it extraordinary? We're being liberated by people who look a bit like us
Yeah, well,
from all of these.
you've touched upon, I think, Britain's biggest psychological problem, which is that our national narrative revolves around World War II, right? And there's a clear narrative associated with World War II, which is that we were the good guys. Also, we beat the evil racist Germans. So that makes it very difficult for us to accept certain things. For example, that we were actually, as British imperialists, massively racist, at least during the 19th century and early 20th century, that we created a lot of modern racist ideas, which then went to Germany and America and so on, that we created a lot of weird racial science, which still influences Nazis around the world today. So, yeah, British people, I think, struggle to comprehend these things. And yeah, especially the narrative, the idea that, people might have been quite happy to get rid of us.
Well, that's right. And it's interesting. Another bit of pub wisdom you hear is that, oh, well, we sacrificed our empire to beat Hitler. Well, actually, we didn't. I mean, India was a slightly separate case. That was definitely by 45 going to get its independence. But Britain fought very hard and rather dirty to hang on to most of its empire, especially Malaya, and
Yeah,
made quite a lot of money out of it in the 50s under Labour governments as well as Conservative one.
yeah, we got to remember Britain was more, pushing bankruptcy, wasn't it, after the war? And they had in British Malaya an incredibly lucrative colony.
Yeah.
You're gonna want to hold on to it.
Yeah.
But this leads us to I think one of my favorite empire facts, which is why was the 1948 Malayan emergency called the Malayan emergency?
I don't
Can
know.
you remember?
No.
For insurance reasons. Because if you call it a war, the companies there don't get payouts. And also, this is my theory, these kind of euphemisms is one of the reasons why so many dark episodes of Empire are poorly understood. It doesn't sound so bad, does it? The Malayan emergency. And there's similar things when, like the Tibet expedition of 1903. That sounds like a scientific adventure. Actually, we invaded Tibet and we mowed down a load of monks with machine guns, defenseless monks, But call it expedition. I think
so. This is 1940s Britain's version of Putin's special military operation.
Yeah, and I think it's known as the Anti-British National Liberation War, actually in Malaya, which is rather clearer. But it was a kind of a guerrilla war that pitted British Empire, the military might against, these socialists. And the spark was the killing of 3 rubber plantation managers, and it went on for quite a long time. But Caroline Elkins, in her amazing book, Legacy of Violence, the History of the British Empire.
Yeah, that's a very big book, very important
Big book. But he also talks about how this episode was one of the darkest episodes in the history of the British Empire. So let's just talk about some of the things the British did. I mean, they attempted to starve people by limiting food. They massacred livestock and people. They destroyed crops by dropping herbicides, including Agent Orange, from the sky. They imposed curfews, collective punishments, together with a death sentence for a range of offences, including just possessing firearms and consorting with the enemy. And there was one particularly awful incident, and it was referred to as Britain's Malaya, where 24 unarmed villagers on a rubber estate were massacred by British soldiers. Again, just not a narrative that kind of sows in with the the idea of us as defeaters of Nazis and on the side of right.
Well, it's kind of both, isn't it? I mean, I wouldn't want to live in a world where we hadn't stood up to Hitler, the British at that time. But of course, they write the Atlantic Charter, and everybody gets very excited. This is before the Japanese get involved, and all the colonies in the Far East, they immediately all rush to London, where they send their ambassadors or whatever, say, "Great, the Atlantic Charter, we're going to have self-determination."
Yeah.
And Churchill, I've actually got a quote. It's a wonderful weasel words. And Churchill loved to use that phrase, weasel words. But the Atlantic Charter, this big statement about war aims and creating a world free of dictators where everybody has self-determination. But he says to his own party privately, not to Roosevelt, he says, of course, such changes would only arise in cases where transference of territory or sovereignty arose, and it's not intended by me that the natives of Nigeria or of East Africa could ever, by a majority vote, simply choose the form of government in which they live. So that's the exact opposite of what the Charter said.
Yeah. I mean, Churchill encapsulates these contradictions, doesn't he? He saved liberal democracy, but also he was responsible for, or was involved in the Bengal famine at the time, where 3 million
All
people
sorts of
died,
things, yeah,
and
yeah.
all sorts of racism, even by the standards of his time. But Carol Elkins points out in relation to this, at the same time that we were drafting the European Convention on Human Rights, a great thing, in Malaya, we were torturing people by starvation, locking them in cages in the hot sun for days at a time, force feeding them soapy water, kicking and punching and beating people. And so this is happening at the same time. So yeah, a profound contradiction.
Was part of the problem that it was rather convenient that communism arose. It allowed people who wanted to hang on to colonies to say, there's a new global conflict now. We've beaten the Nazis, we've got rid of the Japanese, but there's the Cold War. And, they say they're nationalists, but they're really communists, aren't they?
Yeah, and I was thinking about that as I was Googling this before our session, and I happened across the Imperial War Museum website on the Malayan emergency, and it still talks about the communists as terrorists. And I think that would be challenged as a description in Malaya. But equally, the British kind of sowed division in the territory. And one of the things they did and won people over to their cause to a degree is by giving Chinese workers, status. And yeah, they managed to divide and rule when it came to this ideology.
They also won as well. I mean, unlike Vietnam, they actually managed to, and I think that the writing was on the wall. I think by the late 60s, is independent. But in terms of a military campaign, they do manage to kind of defeat these, whatever you want to call them, nationalist guerrillas.
Yes, and I think it wasn't just a military defeat, like I say, I think it was political as well, in that these communists, their ideology could be defeated in some. They won the argument in some ways.
And it's the same region, but I've once did a whole show on the origins of the Vietnam Wars in my TV career, and Ho Chi Minh, was writing these begging letters to the Americans, quoting from the Declaration of Independence. He'd worked with the Americans during the war. They were allies with him against the Japanese, and they just stopped returning his calls. And
I didn't know that.
And that set the world up for three more wars over 20 odd years, and massive, massive death toll.
I didn't know that actually. But yeah, I think mentally we don't go to South Asia, do we? Southeast Asia, when we think of this history.
Well, I think certainly in terms of the Second World War, we obviously we think about the Nazism and the Blitz and this heroic idea that Britain is this plucky underdog. Well, Britain had been anything but an underdog in most of the world.
This is another part of our national psyche. We are the underdog. All the battles and the wars that we remember often are things that we lost, like Gallipoli, right? These are the things we commemorate.
Dunkirk.
And it doesn't really connect with the fact that we ran the biggest empire in human history. I'll talk about this in Empire Land, and I think it's because facing up to the fact that we were the biggest in human history is quite a difficult thing to face up to. It's much easier and much more appealing to see ourselves as kind of heroic failures. And it's kind of extends to our football team, doesn't it?
Oh, without doubt. But in Empire Land, I'd say, and Empire World rather, I think it's possible to detect the way you write the story. You have quite a lot of admiration for some of these figures. They're very energetic, they're very ingenious. The guys with the plants. That the British Empire had qualities that are quite admirable, as well as all the violence and the racism. Is that fair?
I mean, it's always complicated. I mean, it's all deeply contradictory. I mean, in relation to rubber, it's amazing that Kew Gardens, I think they spent £1,500 on this project, and it resulted in a major global industry, right? Which is still around today. But you need to remember at the same time, it also resulted in mass murder, right? So opposite things can be true at the same time.
They can. And I think there's a quote from David Olasanga, who I'm probably going to misquote him, where he says, we shouldn't tell our stories from the past to make us feel comfortable. We should probably choose the ones that make us feel uncomfortable.
Yeah, and I think that applies when it comes to empire to the left and the right. I mean, there's this obsession with feeling shame about empire, also feeling pride of empire. I think both are problematic, not least because you weren't there. It's got nothing to do with you. I don't think you were involved in slavery or the Malayan emergency.
And my dad might have been.
Your dad might have been, but also, it's not your fault if your dad was. And it's weird. We don't talk about other parts of history like this. We don't talk about, oh, I'm so ashamed of the Industrial Revolution or the Stone Age.
That's interesting.
It's only British Empire where it's all about feeling. And I think it's because lots of us have family connections, either on the side of the colonizers like you or the colonized like me. And so it can feel personal, but I think we should endeavor to turn it into an intellectual exercise.
Well, Alan Lester was on the podcast a couple of weeks ago talking about opium.
Oh, yeah. I listened to that one. I listened to it.
Oh,
yeah.
Thank you. Well, Alan has also given me a bit of advice on the project I'm working on at the moment. And he said that I'd actually found something he didn't know, and he spent a long time looking into this stuff. That at this period in 45 and 46, did you know that the British and the British Indian Army, which is what it still was, armed 50,000 Japanese prisoners of war and sent them into battle in both Vietnam and Indonesia?
I heard that on your podcast.
To put the colonists back in power. Again, a slightly flagrant breach of the Atlantic Charter, but also every newspaper at that time was full of stories of the camps and the death railways and how appalling the Japanese had been. And here we were, Mountbatten himself hired 50,000 of them, gave them weapons. And the battles in Indonesia were the biggest battles the British Army have fought since the Second World War to this day. I mean, they're massive battles with Japanese troops under British command. One of them was recommended for a military medal, but the government said, maybe we won't do that.
Yeah, I mean, in British Empire, the history of it's full of contradictions, and not least because I'm Sikh. I often find myself challenged by the facts on the ground. I mean, one of the most famous massacres in the history of the British Empire, Jallianwala Bagh, and Amritsar, and many of the victims are Sikh, and that's the way I always saw it, as a clear example of the British killing a load of Sikhs. But actually, they were Sikh soldiers doing the shooting. And doesn't that complicate things?
Well, I think as we move further away from the age of empire, it gets harder and harder to understand why colonized people could be very loyal to it. But at the time, maybe it felt obvious.
Yeah, I mean, the British is a part of their strategy, to fetishize certain racial groups, indulge them, and earn their loyalty. I mean,
especially in India.
Yeah, and the Sikhs, and the Sikhs took the side of the British at the Indian Mutiny. Not all of them, but most and lots of them, officially they did. And then guess what? The British came up with this racial theory that the Sikhs were a military race. And it was such a powerful theory, the idea that we're this warrior race. It's the prism through which a lot of Sikhs see themselves now. The Gurkhas do this too. The Nepalese talk about themselves almost entirely, well, often through the prism of this racial theory, which is obviously complete nonsense. As you can see, you could probably take me in a fight. There's nothing intrinsically martial about any race, but that's how powerful these ideas were when they were given by the British to certain groups.
What do you think there was an alternative? Certainly thinking about the end of the Second World War, which had at least publicly been fought for all these great principles. Was there a realistic chance that Britain and other colonial powers could have said, right, clean slate, here's the date, we're going to be gone by this date, or was that never realistic given just
you think
economics?
Was there a realistic plan to just leave suddenly? Well, I think that was one of the problems in India, in that they suddenly left, and it went from them ruling it to them legging it, and up to 2 million people dying at partition. I find it very interesting that one of the people who argued against us leaving at all was Enoch Powell. He
Is that
wrote this
right?
report to Winston Churchill explaining why we should stay in India after World War II. And Winston Churchill thought Enoch Powell had gone mad. So isn't that interesting? Enoch Powell's great ambition in life was to be Viceroy of India. And he kind of had a mini nervous breakdown when India left because that was his entire purpose in life. And I think it largely explains why he went a bit mad and explains his politics and why he ended up becoming our local MP in Wolverhampton and the Rivers of Blood speech and then an Ulster Unionist, because he lost his mission in life. But yeah, I mean, there were all sorts of possibilities after 1945. There were all sorts of possibilities, and what happened, it was not set in stone.
Well, I mean, I think one of the things it was the change in America because certainly Roosevelt was publicly very committed to New Age without empires. But suddenly America was becoming a sort of empire itself, and they were not keen to let go of some of the places they were taking, these very strategic islands in the Pacific, for example. And I think the pressure was no longer held to the Europeans.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by this idea that a lot of Americans have that they are in themselves anti-imperial when pretty much as soon as they beat the British, they started acting like the British Empire. I mean, the way America expanded was pretty much how Australia and South Africa worked with terms of settler colonialism. The racist ideology was the same. They had colonies, again, often not well understood, the Philippines,
Yeah.
Puerto Rico. And I would say you're seeing it now. Donald Trump is behaving like a 19th century British imperialist. He wants to invade Canada, wants to take over the Panama Canal, wants to push indigenous Americans out of their reserves, and he wants to also control tech. And what was the East India Company but an effort to monopolize,
So
right?
interesting.
And what did the East India Company do? It lobbied MPs, it gave donations to the king. And that's what big tech does. And then it became too big to fail and became part of the state. And I can foresee a day where these tech companies become part of the American state. You saw it at the inauguration where they were lined up, right? And I felt like that is the East India Company
That is so
before the
interesting. I never thought about
Indian.
that. Yeah, and everything just goes online, and Musk runs all the kind of social security system or something.
Yeah, and the East India Company was all about monopolies. Create a monopoly, opium or whatever, and then charge exorbitant rates. And this is pretty much how the mentality of tech, isn't it? Except what they're monopolizing is data.
I mean,
And
maybe we've lived through an age that is the exception, not the rule. The era of decolonization and independent nations. But before that, for centuries and centuries, the world was very different. It was all about great powers grabbing things and competing with each other for stuff. Maybe now it's the age of Trumps and Putins and
totally, yeah.
the Chinese. We're going back to that kind of almost like a 19th century. Let's carve up the plum pudding.
Yeah, and what is China doing in Africa? It's buying up financial influence, right? You could call it pretty much what the Europeans were doing. It's
Yeah.
buying or imposing influence upon African nations. And it's one of the new empires, right? But it's always an
So interesting. Look, I realise I've had my half hour, and it must be gin and tonic time where you are, surely.
empire. Or a cup of tea, both imperial.
Both imperial,
Yeah.
and I'd say two of the better results of the British Empire.
Or opium.
Oh, I'm not having any opium tonight. Maybe tomorrow. Thank you so much, Sathnam. That was so interesting.
No, it was a pleasure chatting. Thank you for
Really good
having
to
me.
talk to you. Take care.
Take care.
Bye. Well, I hope you found that as interesting as I did. In fact, I guess I could say that about all the interviews I do. I hope you find them as interesting as I do. Really interesting chap, Sathnam. And really, I think it connects a lot of what we were talking about, connects to the tone of voice I try to capture in my book about Empire. Obviously, the book is the final book in a trilogy that I've called a love letter to the generation that fought the Second World War. Now, clearly, there's so many positive things I want to say. I used to be in the RAF. My first volume is about the Battle of Britain. Obviously, I feel very passionately that these people did an extraordinary thing, that generation that stood up. And at the beginning of the war, it was by no means certain that they would be victorious. It took a lot of courage, both political courage and individual courage, in the early years of the war to stand up against Nazism and later Japanese militarism. I'm in no doubt that the world is a much, much better place for Britain, its power, its people, and yes, its empire, because it was necessary, the power of the British Empire. And often, and I mentioned this in the book too, I think the British people are very much in love with the idea of themselves as the underdogs in the Second World War, hanging on against the odds, especially in 1940, where actually the world never quite saw Britain like that at all. Its enemies, its allies, its subjects did not see Britain as an underdog. Quite the reverse. And that's an important, once you start to see the story through those other non-British eyes, I think you understand it better and you can have a fairer reckoning, which I guess is what I'm trying to do in my book. So yeah, let me know what you think. There's plenty more of Angela and other great characters and great stories. Meanwhile, please keep liking, please keep subscribing. And if I managed to pique your interest in 1945 The Reckoning, it's now available on Amazon for pre-order in the UK, but it'll be published in Australia, in New Zealand, and in India. Obviously, I'd love to get a deal in America. If the book does well, perhaps it will come out in America too. But if you're American or Canadian and you're interested, you probably have to buy the book from the British website or wait for get an ebook. I'm sure the ebooks will be available, and indeed the audio. I think the audio version could be really good, actually, because I think the publisher's putting quite a bit of effort into producing a really polished book. And what I used to do, my earlier books, I haven't had a book published for nearly 20 years. In those days, it was all cassettes or CDs, and they abridged. So you might actually buy this audio book, and you'd only get about a half or less. But now, of course, with streaming, it's every word. So, which may be a good or a bad thing. But yeah, I'm excited for the audiobook. And if you're not British or Australian or New Zealand or Indian, that might be your best way of getting hold of it. All right, enough self-publicity for one day. Thank you for your time. Please keep liking and subscribing. And buy a mug if you like as well. All the best. Bye.
This has been a Podcast World production. If you want to contact me, write to team@podcastworld.org, placing Scandal Mongers in the heading, or you can reach out via the social media links in the show's bio. And if you've enjoyed this episode and you want to support the show, please consider taking a few seconds to hit the donate button found just below this video. Many thanks, and see you next week.